Chapter 18 of Clairvoyance and the Body of Light, its Power and its Development. Also concerning divination, within the human body is another body of approximately the same size and shape (1) but made of a subtler and less illusory material. It is of course not real, but then no more is the other body. Before treating of clairvoyance, one must discuss briefly this question of reality, for misapprehension on this subject has given rise to endless trouble. There is the story of the American in the train who saw another American carrying a basket of unusual shape. His curiosity mastered him, and he leant across and said, "Say, stranger, what you got in that bag?" The other, lantern-jawed and taciturn, replied, "Mongoose." The first man was rather baffled, as he had never heard of a mongoose. After a pause he pursued, at the risk of a rebuff, "But say, what is a mongoose?" "Mongoose eats snakes," replied the other. This was another poser, but he pursued, "What in hell do you want a mongoose for?" "Well, you see," said the second man, in a confidential whisper, "my brother sees snakes." The first man was more puzzled than ever, but after a long think, he continued rather pathetically, "But say, the main real snakes." "Sure," said the man with the basket, "but this mongoose ain't real either." This is a perfect parable of magic. There is no such thing as truth in the perceptible universe. Every idea when analyzed is found to contain a contradiction. It is quite useless, except as a temporary expedient, to set up one class of ideas against another as being more real. The advance of man towards God is not necessarily an advance towards truth. All philosophical systems have crumbled, but each class of ideas possesses true relations within itself. It is possible, with Berkeley, one to deny the existence of water and wood, but, for all that, wood floats on water. The magician becomes identical with the immortal Osiris, yet the magician dies. In this dilemma the facts must be restated. One should preferably say that the magician becomes conscious of that part of himself which he calls the immortal Osiris, and that part does not die. Now this interior body of the magical, of which we spoke at the beginning of this chapter, does exist, and can exert certain powers which his natural body cannot do. It can, for example, pass through matter, and it can move freely in every direction through space. But this is because matter, in the sense in which we commonly use the word, is on another plane. 2 Now this fine body perceives a universe which we do not ordinarily perceive. It does not necessarily perceive the universe which we do normally perceive, so although in this body I can pass through the roof, it does not follow that I shall be able to tell what the weather is like. I might do so, or I might not, but if I could not, it would not prove that I was deceiving myself in supposing that I had passed through the roof. This body, which is called by various authors the astral double, body of light, body of desire, fine body, simulacra, and numberless other names, is naturally fitted to perceive objects of its own class, in particular, the phantoms of the astral plane. There is a sort of vague and indeterminate relation between the astrals and the materials, and it is possible, with great experience, to deduce facts about material things from the astral aspect which they present to the eyes of the body of light. 3 This astral plane is so varied and so changeable that several clairvoyants looking at the same thing might give totally different accounts of what they saw, yet they might each make correct deductions. In looking at a man, the first clairvoyant might say, "The lines of force are all drooping," the second, "It seems all dirty and spotty," a third, "The aura looks very rad." Yet all might agree in deducing that the man was in ill health. In any case, all such deductions are rather unreliable. One must be a highly skilled man before one can trust one's vision. A great many people think that they are extremely good at the business, when in fact they have only made some occasional shrewd guesses which they naturally remember, in the course of hundreds of forgotten failures. The only way to test clairvoyance is to keep a careful record of every experiment made. For example, Frater M once gave a clairvoyant a waistcoat to psychometrize. He made 56 statements about the owner of the waistcoat. Of these 4 were notable right, 17, though correct, were of that class of statement which is true of almost everybody. The remainder were wrong. It was concluded from this that he showed no evidence of any special power. In fact, his bodily eyes, if he could discern tailoring, would have served him better, for he thought the owner of the vest was a corn chandler, instead of an earl, as he is. The magician can hardly take too much trouble to develop this power in himself. It is extremely useful to him in guarding himself against attack, in obtaining warnings, in judging character, and especially in watching the progress of his ceremonies. There are a great many ways of acquiring the power. Gaze into a crystal, or into a pool of ink in the palm of the hand, or into a mirror, or into a teacup. Just as with a microscope the expert operator keeps both eyes open, though seeing only through the one at the eyepiece of the instrument, so, the natural eyes ceasing to give any message to the brain, the attention is withdrawn from them, and the man begins to see through the astral eyes. These methods appear to the master theorian to be unsatisfactory. Very often they do not work at all. It is difficult to teach a person to use these methods, and, worst of all, they are purely passive. You can see only what is shown you, and you are probably shown things pointless and irrelevant. The proper method is as follows: develop the body of light until it is just as real to you as your other body, teach it to travel to any desired symbol, and enable it to perform all that necessary rites and invocations. In short, educate it. Ultimately, the relation of that body with your own must be exceedingly intimate, but before this harmonizing takes place, you should begin by a careful differentiation. The first thing to do, therefore, is to get the body outside your own. To avoid muddling the two, you begin by imagining a shape resembling yourself standing in front of you. Do not say, "Oh, it's only imagination!" The time to test that is later on, when you have secured a fairly clear mental image of such a body. Try to imagine how your own body would look if you were standing in its place. Try to transfer your consciousness to the body of light. Your own body has its eyes shut. Use the eyes of the body of light to describe the objects in the room behind you. Don't say, "It's only an effort of subconscious memory." The time to test that is later on. As soon as you feel more or less at home in the fine body, let it rise in the air. Keep on feeling the sense of rising, keep on looking about you as you rise until you see landscapes of the astral plane. Such have a quality all their own. They are not like material things, they are not like mental pictures, they seem to lie between the two. After some practice has made you adept, so that in the course of an hour's journey you can reckon on having a fairly eventful time, turn your attention to reaching a definite place on the astral plane. Invoke Mercury, for example, and examine carefully whether the symbols which you have seen correspond with the conventional symbols of Mercury. This testing of the spirits is the most important branch of the whole tree of magic. Without it, one is lost in the jungle of delusion. Every spirit, up to God himself, is ready to deceive you if possible, to make himself out more important than he is, in short, to lay in wait for you in 333 separate ways. Remember that after all the highest of all the gods is only the Magus, one Mayan, the greatest of all the devils. You may also try rising on the planes. 2 With a little practice, especially if you have a good guru, you ought to be able to slip in and out of your astral body as easily as you slip in and out of a dressing gown. It will then no longer be so necessary for your astral body to be sent far off. Without moving an inch you will be able to turn on its eyes and ears as simply as the man with the microscope, mentioned above, can transfer his complete attention from one eye to the other. Now, however unsuccessful your getting out of the body may apparently have been, it is most necessary to use every effort to bring it properly back. Make the body of light coincide in space with the physical body, assume the God form, and vibrate the name of Harpocrates with the utmost energy, then recover unity of consciousness. If you fail to do this properly you may find yourself in serious trouble. Your body of light may wander away uncontrolled, and be attacked and obsessed. You will become aware of this through the occurrence of headache, bad dreams, or even more serious signs such as hysteria, fainting fits, possibly madness or paralysis. Even the worst of these attacks will probably wear off, but it may leave you permanently damaged to a greater or less extent. A great majority of spiritualists, occultists, Tososophists, one are pitiable examples of repeated losses from this cause. The emotional type of religionist also suffers in this way. Devotion projects the fine body, which is seized and vampirized by the demon masquerading as Christ or Mary, or whoever may be the object of worship. Complete absence of all power to concentrate thought, to follow an argument, to formulate a will, to hold fast to an opinion or a course of action, or even to keep a solemn oath, mark indelibly those who have lost parts of their souls. They wander from one new cult to another even crazier. Occasionally such persons drift for a moment into the surroundings of the master Therion, and are shot out by the simple process of making them try to do a half-hour honest work of any kind. In projecting the astral, it is a valuable additional safeguard to perform the whole operation in a properly consecrated circle. Proceed with great caution, then, but proceed. In time your body of light will be as strong against the spirits as your other body against the winds of heaven. All depends upon the development of that body of light. It must be furnished with an organism as ramified and balanced as its shadowy brother, the material body. To recapitulate once more, then, the first task is to develop your own body of light within your own circle without reference to any other inhabitants of the world to which it belongs. That which you have accomplished with the subject you may now proceed to do with the object. You will learn to see with your astral eyes the astral appearance of material things, and although this does not properly belong to pure clairvoyance, one may here again mention that you should endeavor to the utmost to develop and fortify this body of light. The best and simplest way to do this is to use it constantly, to exercise it in every way. In particular it may be employed in ceremonies of initiation or of invocation while the physical body remains silent and still. In doing this it will often be necessary to create a temple on the astral plane. It is excellent practice to create symbols. This one precaution is needed: after using them, they should be reabsorbed. Having learned to create astral forms, the next step will be at first very difficult. Phantasmal and fleeting as the astral is in general, those forms which are definitely attached to the material possess enormous powers of resistance, and it consequently requires very high potential to influence them. Their material analogues seem to serve as a fortress. Even when a temporary effect is produced, the inertia of matter draws it back to the normal. Yet the power of the trained and consecrated will in the well-developed astral body is such that it can even produce a permanent change in the material upon whose body of light you are working. For example, one can heal the sick by restoring a healthy appearance to their astral forms. On the other hand, it is possible so to disintegrate the body of light even of a strong man that he will fall dead. Such operations demand not only power, but judgment. Nothing can upset the total sum of destiny. Everything must be paid for to the uttermost farthing. For this reason a great many operations theoretically possible cannot be performed. Suppose, for example, you see two men of similarly unhealthy astral appearance. In one case the cause may be slight and temporary. Your help suffices to restore him in a few minutes. The other, who looks no worse, is really oppressed by a force incalculably greater than you could control, and you would only damage yourself by attempting to help him. The diagnosis between the two cases could be made by an investigation of the deeper strata of the astral, such as compose the causal body. A body of black magicians, under Anna Kingsford, one once attempted to kill a vivisector who was not particularly well known, and they succeeded in making him serious ill. But in attempting the same thing with Pasteur they produced no effect whatever, because Pasteur was a great genius and adept in his own line far greater than she in hers, and because millions of people were daily blessing him. It cannot be too clearly understood that magical force is subject to the same laws of proportion as any other kind of force. It is useless for a mere millionaire to try to bankrupt a man who has the Bank of England behind him. To sum up, the first task is to separate the astral form from the physical body, the second to develop the powers of the astral body, in particular those of sight, travel, and interpretation, third, to unify the two bodies without muddling them. This being accomplished, The magician is fitted to deal with the invisible. It is now useful to continue with considerations of other planes, which have commonly been classed under the astral. There is some reason for this, as the delimitations are somewhat vague. Just as the vegetable kingdom merges into the animal, and as the material plane has beings which encroach upon the boundaries of the astral, so do we find it in the higher planes. The mental images which appear during meditation are subjective, and pertain not at all to the astral plane. Only very rarely do astral images occur during meditation. It is a bad break in the circle, as a rule, when they do. There is also a magical plane. This touches the material, and even includes a portion of it. It includes the astral, chiefly a full-blooded type of the astral. It reaches to and includes most, if not all, of the spiritual planes. The magical planes is thus the most comprehensive of all. Egyptian gods are typical inhabitants of this plane, and it is the home of every adept. The spiritual planes are of several types, but are all distinguished by a reality and intensity to be found nowhere else. Their inhabitants are formless, free of space and time, and distinguished by incomparable brilliance. There are also a number of subplanes, as, for example, the alchemical. This plane will often appear in the practice of rising on the planes. Its images are usually those of gardens curiously kept, mountains furnished with peculiar symbols, hieroglyphic animals, or such figures as those of the Hermetic Arcanum, and pictures like the Gold Seekers and the Massacre of the Innocents of Basil Valentine. There is a unique quality about the alchemical plane which renders its images immediately recognizable. There are also planes corresponding to various religions past and present, all of which have their peculiar unity. It is of the utmost importance to the clairvoyant or traveler in the fine body to be able to find his way to any desired plane, and operate therein as its ruler. The neophyte is examined most strictly in this practice before he is passed to the degree of zelator. In rising on the planes one must usually pass clear through the astral, a long way for some people, to the spiritual. Some will be unable to do this. The fine body which is good enough to subsist on lower planes, a shadow among shadows, will fail to penetrate the higher strata. It requires a great development of this body, and an intense infusion of the highest spiritual constituents of man, before he can pierce the veils. The constant practice of magic is the best preparation possible. Even though the human consciousness fail to reach the goal, the consciousness of the fine body itself may do so, wherefore whoso travels in that body on a subsequent occasion may be found worthy, and its success will again react favorable on the human consciousness, and increase its likelihood of success in its next magical operation. Similarly, the powers gained in this way will strengthen the magician in his meditation practices. His will becomes better able to assist the concentration, to destroy the mental images which disturb it, and to reject the lesser rewards of the practice which tempt, and too often to the progress of, the mystic. Although it is said that the spiritual lies beyond the astral, this is theoretical. One The advanced magician will not find it to be so. In practice, he will be able by suitable invocations to travel to any place desired. In Liber 418 an example of perfection is given. The adept who explored these ethais did not have to pass through and beyond the universe, the whole of which yet lies within even the inmost, 30th, ethia. He was able to summon the ethais he wanted, and his chief difficulty was that sometimes he was at first unable to pierce their veils. In fact, as the book shows, it was only by virtue of successive and most exalted initiations undergone in the ethais themselves that he was able to penetrate beyond the 15th. The guardians of such fortresses know how to guard. The Master Therian has published the most important practical magical secrets in the plainest language. No one, by virtue of being clever or learned, has understood one word, and those unworthy who have profaned the sacrament have but eaten and drunk damnation to themselves. One may indeed bring down stolen fire in a hollow tube from heaven, as the Master Therian indeed has done in a way that no other adept dared to do before him. But the thief, the Titan, must foreknow and consent to his doom to be chained upon a lonely rock, the vulture devouring his liver, for a season, until Hercules, the strong man armed by virtue of that very fire, shall come and release him. The Teuton one whose number is the number of a man, 662 unsubdued, consoled by Australasia and Panthea, must send forth constant showers of blessing not only upon man whose incarnation he is, but upon the tyrant and persecutor. His infinite pain must thrill his heart with joy, since every pang is but the echo of some new flame that leaps upon the earth lit by his crime. For the gods are the enemies of man, it is nature that man must overcome ere he enter into his kingdom. 3 The true God is man. In man are all things hidden. Of these the gods, nature, time, all the powers of the universe are rebellious slaves. It is these that men must fight and conquer in the power and in the name of the beast that hath availed them, the Titan, the Magus, the man whose number is 666. 3 The practice of rising on the plains is of such importance that special attention must be paid to it. It is part of the essential technique of magic. Instruction in this practice has been given with such superb conciseness in Libro, that one cannot do better than quote verbatim. The previous experiment referred to in the first sentence is the ordinary astral journey. 1. The previous experiment has little value, and leads to few results of importance. But it is susceptible of a development which merges into a form of dharana concentration and as such may lead to the very highest ends. The principal use of the practice in the last chapter is to familiarize the student with every kind of obstacle and every kind of delusion, so that he may be perfect master of every idea that may arise in his brain, to dismiss it, to transmute it, to cause it instantly to obey his will. 2. Let him then begin exactly as before, but with the most intense solemnity and determination. 3. Let him be very careful to cause his imaginary body to rise in a line exactly perpendicular to the earth's tangent at the point where his physical body is situated, or, to put it more simply, straight upwards. 4. Instead of stopping, let him continue to rise until fatigue almost overcomes him. If he should find that he has stopped without willing to do so, and that figure appear, let him at all costs rise above them. Yea, though his very life tremble on his lips, let him force his way upward and onward. 5. Let him continue in this so long as the breath of life is in him. Whatever threatens, whatever allures, though it were Typhon and all his hosts loosed from the pit and leagued against him, though it were from the very throne of God himself that a voice issues bidding him stay and be content, let him struggle on, ever on. 6. At last there must come a moment when his whole being is swallowed up in fatigue, overwhelmed by its own inertia. Let him sink, when no longer can he strive, though his tongue be bitten through with the effort and the blood gush from his nostrils, into the blackness of unconsciousness, and then on coming to himself, let him write down soberly and accurately a record of all that hath occurred, yea, a record of all that hath occurred. Of course, the rising may be done from any starting point. One can go, for example, into the circle of Jupiter, and the results, especially in the lower planes, will be very different to those obtained from a Saturnian starting point. The student should undertake a regular series of such experiments, in order to familiarize himself not only with the nature of the different sphere, but with the inner meaning of each. Of course, it is not necessary in every case to push the practice to exhaustion, as described in the instruction, but this is the proper thing to do whenever definitely practicing, in order to acquire the power of rising. But, having obtained this power, it is, of course, legitimate to rise to any particular plane that may be necessary for the purpose of exploration, as in the case of the visions recorded in Liber 418, where the method may be described as mixed. In such a case, it is not enough to invoke the place you wish to visit, because you may not be able to endure its pressure or to breathe its atmosphere. Several instances occur in that record where the seer was unable to pass through certain gateways, or to remain in certain contemplations. He had to undergo certain initiations before he was able to proceed. Thus, it is necessary that the technique of magic should be perfected. The body of light must be rendered capable of going everywhere and doing everything. It is, therefore, always the question of drill which is of importance. You have got to go out rising on the plains every day of your life, year after year. You are not to be disheartened by failure, or too much encouraged by success, in any one practice or set of practices. What you are doing is what will be of real value to you in the end. And that is, developing a character, creating a karma, which will give you the power to do your will. For divination is so important a branch of magic as almost to demand a separate treatise. Genius is composed of two sides, the active and the passive. The power to execute the will is but blind force unless the will be enlightened. At every stage of a magical operation it is necessary to know what one is doing, and to be sure that one is acting wisely. Acute sensitiveness is always associated with genius. The power to perceive the universe accurately, to analyze, coordinate and judge impressions is the foundation of all great work. An army is but a blundering brute unless its intelligence department works as it should. The magician obtains the transcendental knowledge necessary to an intelligent course of conduct directly in consciousness by clairvoyance and clairaudience, but communication with superior intelligences demands elaborate preparation, even after years of successful performance. It is therefore useful to possess an art by which one can obtain at a moment's notice any information that may be necessary. This art is divination. The answers to one's questions in divination are not conveyed directly but through the medium of a suitable series of symbols. These symbols must be interpreted by the diviner in terms of his problem. It is not practicable to construct a lexicon in which the solution of every difficulty is given in so many words. It would be unwieldy, besides which, nature does not happen to work on those lines. The theory of any process of divination may be explained in a few simple terms. 1. We postulate the existence of intelligences, either within or without the diviner, of which he is not immediately conscious. It does not matter to the theory whether the communicating spirit so-called is an objective entity or a concealed portion of the diviner's mind. We assume that such intelligences are able to reply correctly within limits to the questions asked. 2. We postulate that it is possible to construct a compendium of hieroglyphs sufficiently elastic in meaning to include every possible idea, and that one or more of these may always be taken to represent any idea. We assume that any of these hieroglyphics will be understood by the intelligences with whom we wish to communicate in the same sense as ourselves. We have therefore a sort of language. One may compare it to a lingua franca which is perhaps defective in expressing fine shades of meaning, and so is unsuitable for literature, but which yet serves for the conduct of daily affairs in places where many tongues are spoken. Hindustani is an example of this. But better still is the analogy between the conventional signs and symbols employed by mathematicians, who can thus convey their ideas perfectly without speaking a word of each other's languages. 13. We postulate that the intelligences whom we wish to consult are willing, or may be compelled, to answer us truthfully. Let us first consider the question of the compendium of symbols. The alphabet of a language is a more or less arbitrary way of transcribing the sounds employed in it. The letters themselves have not necessarily any meaning as such. But in a system of divination each symbol stands for a definite idea. It would not interfere with the English language to add a few new letters. In fact, some systems of shorthand have done so. But a system of symbols for divination must be a complete representation of the universe, so that each is absolute, and the whole insusceptible to increase or diminution. It is, in fact, technically a particle in the fullest sense of the word. Let us consider some prominent examples of such systems. We may observe that a common mode of divination is to inquire of books by placing the thumb at random within the leaves. The books of the Sibyl, the works of Virgil, and the Bible have been used very frequently for this purpose. For theoretical justification, one must assume that the book employed is a perfect representation of the universe. But even if this were the case, it is an inferior form of construction, because the only reasonable conception of the cosmos is mathematical and hieroglyphic rather than literary. In the case of a book, such as the Book of the Law, which is the supreme truth and the perfect rule of life, it is not repugnant to good sense to derive an oracle from its pages. It will of course be remarked that the Book of the Law is not merely a literary compilation but a complex mathematical structure. It therefore fulfills the required conditions. The principal means of divination in history are astrology, geomancy, the tarot, the Holy Kabbalah, and the Yi King. 1 There are hundreds of others, from pyromancy, anaromancy, auguries from sacrifices, and the spinning top of some ancient oracles to the omens drawn from the flight of birds and the prophesying of tea leaves. It will be sufficient for our present purposes to discuss on the 5 systems first enumerated. Astrology is theoretically a perfect method, since the symbols employed actually exist in the macrocosm, and thus possess a natural correspondence with microcosmic affairs. But in practice the calculations involved are overwhelmingly complicated. A horoscope is never complete. It needs to be supplemented by innumerable other horoscopes. For example, to obtain a judgment on the simplest question, one requires not only the nativities of the people involved, some of which are probably inaccessible, but secondary figures for directions and transits, together with progressed horoscopes, to say nothing of prenatal, mundane, and even horary figures. To appreciate the entire mass of data, and to balance the elements of so vast a concourse of forces, and to draw a single judgment therefrom, is a task practically beyond human capacity. Besides all this, the actual effects of the planetary positions and aspects are still almost entirely unknown. No 2 astrologers agree on all points, and most of them are at odds on fundamental principles. 2 The science had better be discarded unless the student chances to feel strongly drawn toward it. It is used by the master theorian himself with fairly satisfactory results, but only in special cases, in a strictly limited sphere, and with particular precautions. Even so, he feels great diffidence in basing his conduct on the results so obtained. Geomancy has the advantage of being rigorously mathematical. A handbook of the science is to be found in Equinox I, 2. 1 The objection to its use lies in the limited number of the symbols. To represent the universe by no more than 16 combinations throws too much work upon them. There is also a great restriction arising from the fact that although 15 symbols appear in the final figure, there are, in reality, but 4, the remaining 11 being drawn by an ineluctable process from the mothers. It may be added that the tables given in the handbook for the interpretation of the figures are exceedingly vague on the one hand, and insufficiently comprehensive on the other. Some adepts, however, appear to find this system admirable, and obtain great satisfaction from its use. Once more, the personal equation must be allowed full weight. At one time the master theorian employed it extensively, but he was never wholly at ease with it. He found the interpretation very difficult. Moreover, it seemed to him that the geomantic intelligences themselves were of a low order. The scope of their knowledge was confined to a small section of the things which interested him. Also, they possessed a point of view of their own which was far from sympathetic with his, so that misunderstanding constantly interfered with the work. The tarot and the Holy Kabbalah may be discussed together. The theoretical basis of both is identical. The Tree of Life. 2 The 78 symbols of the tarot are admirably balanced and combined. They are adequate to all demands made upon them. Each symbol is not only mathematically precise, but possesses an artistic significance which helps the diviner to understand them by stimulating high aesthetic perceptions. The master theorian finds that the tarot is infallible in material questions. The successive operations describe the course of events with astonishing wealth and detail, and the judgments are reliable in all respects. But a proper divination means at least 2 hours hard work, even by the improved method developed by him from the traditions of initiates. 1 Any attempt to shorten the proceedings leads to disappointment. Furthermore, the symbols do not lend themselves readily to the solution of spiritual questions. The Holy Kabbalah, based as it is on pure number, evidently possesses an infinite number of symbols. Its scope is coterminous with existence itself, and it lacks nothing in precision, purity, or indeed in any other perfection. But as cannot be taught (2) each man must select for himself the materials for the main structure of his system. It requires years of work to erect a worthy building. Such a building is never finished, every day spent on it adds new ornaments. The Kabbalah is therefore a living temple of the Holy Ghost. It is the man himself and his universe expressed in terms of thought whose language is so rich that even the letters of its alphabet have no limit. This system is so sublime that it is unsuited to the petty puzzles of our earthly existence. In the light of the Kabbalah, the shadows of transitory things are instantly banished. The Yi King is the most satisfactory system for general work. The Master Therian is engaged in the preparation of a treatise on the subject, but the labor involved is so great that he cannot pledge himself to have it ready at any definite time. 3 The student must therefore make his own investigations into the meaning of the 64 hexagrams as best he can. The Yin King is mathematical and philosophical in form. Its structure is cognate with that of the Kabbalah. The identity is so intimate that the existence of two such superficially different systems is transcendent testimony to the truth of both. It is in some ways the most perfect hieroglyph ever constructed. It is austere and sublime, yet withal so adaptable to every possible emergency that its figures may be interpreted to suit all classes of questions. One may resolve the most obscure spiritual difficulties no less than the most mundane dilemmas, and the symbol which opens the gates of the most exalted palaces of initiation is equally effective when employed to advise one in the ordinary business of life. The Master Therian has found the Yi King entirely satisfactory in every respect. The intelligences which direct it show no inclination to evade the question or to mislead the current. A further advantage is that the actual apparatus is simple. Also the system is easy to manipulate, and 5 minutes is sufficient to obtain a fairly detailed answer to any but the most obscure questions. With regard to the intelligences whose business it is to give information to the diviner, it may be said roughly that their natures differ widely, and correspond more or less to the character of the medium of divination. Thus, the geomantic intelligences are gnomes, spirits of an earthy nature, distinguished from each other by the modifications due to the various planetary and zodiacal influences which govern the several symbols. The intelligence governing Puella is not to be confused with that of Venus or Libra. It is simply a particular terrestrial demon which partakes of those natures. The tarot, on the other hand, being a book, is under Mercury, and the intelligence of each card is fundamentally mercurial. Such symbols are therefore peculiarly proper to communicate thought. They are not gross, like the geomantic demons, but, as against this, they are unscrupulous in deceiving the diviner. 1 The Yi King is served by beings free from these defects. The intense purity of the symbols prevents them from being usurped by intelligences with an axe of their own to grind. 2 It is always essential for the diviner to obtain absolute magical control over the intelligences of the system which he adopts. He must not leave the smallest loophole for them to use casuistry and interpretation of his questions. It is a common knavery, especially in geomancy, to render an answer which is literally true and yet deceives. For instance, one might ask whether some business transaction would be profitable, and find, after getting an affirmative answer, that it really referred to the other party to the affair. There is, on the surface, no difficulty at all in getting replies. In fact, the process is mechanical, success is therefore assured, bar a stroke of apoplexy. But, even suppose we are safe from deceit, how can we know that the question has really been put to another mind, understood tightly, and answered from knowledge? It is obviously possible to check one's operations by clairvoyance, but this is rather like buying a safe to keep a brick in. Experience is the only teacher. One acquires what one may almost call a new sense. One feels in one's self whether one is right or not. The diviner must develop this sense. It resembles the exquisite sensibility of touch which is found in the great billiard player whose fingers can estimate infinitesimal degrees of force, or the similar phenomenon in the professional taster of tea or wine who can distinguish fantastically subtle differences of flavor. It is a hard saying, but in order to divine without error, one ought to be a master of the temple. Divination affords excellent practice for those who aspire to that exalted eminence, for the faintest breath of personal preference will deflect the needle from the pole of truth in the answer. Unless the diviner have banished utterly from his mind the minutest atom of interest in the answer to his question, he is almost certain to influence that answer in favor of his personal inclinations. The psychoanalyst will recall the fact that dreams are phantasmal representations of the unconscious will of the sleeper, and that not only are they images of that will instead of representations of objective truth, but that the image itself is confused by 1,000 cross-currents set in motion by the various complexes and inhibitions of his character. If therefore one consults the oracle, one must make sure that one is not consciously or unconsciously bringing pressure to bear upon it. It is just as when an Englishman cross-examines a Hindu, the ultimate answer will probably be what the Hindu imagines will best please the inquirer. The same difficulty appears in a grosser form when one receives a perfectly true reply, but insists on interpreting it so as to suit one's desires. The vast majority of people who go to fortune-tellers have nothing else in mind but the wish to obtain supernatural sanction for their follies. Apart from occultism altogether, everyone knows that when people ask for advice, they only want to be told how wise they are. Hardly anyone acts on the most obviously common-sense counsel if it happens to clash with his previous intentions. Indeed, who would take counsel unless he were warned by some little whisper in his heart that he is about to make a fool of himself, which he is determined to do, and only wants to be able to blame his best friend, or the oracle, when he is overtaken by the disaster which his own interior mentor foresees? Those who embark on divination will be wise to consider the following remarks very deeply. They will know when they are getting deep enough by the fact of the thought beginning to hurt them. It is essential to explore oneself to the utmost, to analyze one's mind until one can be positive, beyond the possibility of error, that one is able to detach oneself entirely from the question. The oracle is a judge, it must be beyond bribery and prejudice. It is impossible in practice to lay down rules for the interpretation of symbols. Their nature must be investigated by intellectual methods such as the Kabbalah, but the precise shade of meaning in any one case, and the sphere and tendency of its application, must be acquired partly by experience, that is, by induction, by recording and classifying one's experiments over a long period, and this is the better part by refining one's ratiocination to the point where it becomes instinct or intuition, whichever one likes to call it. It is proper in cases where the sphere of the question is well marked to begin the divination by invocations of the forces thereto appropriate. An error of judgment as to the true character of the question would entail penalties proportionate to the extent of that error, and the delusions resulting from a divination fortified by invocation would be more serious than if one had not employed such heavy artillery. There can, however, be no objection to preparing oneself by a general purification and consecration devised with the object of detaching oneself from one's personality and increasing the sensitiveness of one's faculties. All divination comes under the general type of the element air. The peculiar properties of air are in consequence its uniform charak 1. The apparent high sanction for the air would fortify the obstinacy of thetristics. Divination is subtle and intangible. It moves with mysterious ease, expanding, contracting, flowing, responsive to the slightest stress. It receives and transmits every vibration without retaining any. It becomes poisonous when its oxygen is defiled by passing through human lungs. There is a peculiar frame of mind necessary to successful divination. The conditions of the problem are difficult. It is obviously necessary for the mind of the diviner to be concentrated absolutely upon his question. Any intrusive thought will confuse the oracle as certainly as the reader of a newspaper is confused when he reads a paragraph into which a few lines have strayed from another column. It is equally necessary that the muscles with which he manipulates the apparatus of divination must be entirely independent of any volition of his. He must lend them for the moment to the intelligence whom he is consulting, to be guided in their movement to make the necessary mechanical actions which determine the physical factor of the operation. It will be obvious that this is somewhat awkward for the diviner who is also a magician, for as a magician he has been constantly at work to keep all his forces under his own control, and to prevent the slightest interference with them by any alien will. It is, in fact, commonly the case, or so says the experience of the master Therion, that the most promising magicians are the most deplorable diviners, and vice versa. It is only when the aspirant approaches perfection that he becomes able to reconcile these two apparently opposing faculties. Indeed, there is no surer sign of all-round success than this ability to put the whole of one's powers at the service of any type of task. With regard to the mind, again, it would seem that concentration on the question makes more difficult the necessary detachment from it. Once again, the diviner stands in need of a considerable degree of attainment in the practices of meditation. He must have succeeded in destroying the tendency of the ego to interfere with the object of thought. He must be able to conceive of a thing out of all relation with anything else. The regular practice of concentration leads to this result. In fact, it destroys the thing itself as we have hitherto conceived it, for the nature of things is always veiled from us by our habit of regarding them as in essential relation with ourselves and our reactions toward them. One can hardly expect the diviner to make samadhi with his question that would be going too far, and destroy the character of the operation by removing the question from the class of concatenated ideas. It would mean interpreting the question in terms of without limit, and thus imply an equally formless answer. But he should approximate to this extreme sufficiently to allow the question entire freedom to make for itself its own proper links with the intelligence directing the answer, preserving its position on its own plane, and evoking the necessary counterpoise to its own deviation from the norm of nothingness. We may recapitulate the above reflections in a practical form. We will suppose that one wishes to divine by geomancy whether or no one should marry, it being assumed that one's physical and emotional impulses suggest so rash a course. The man takes his wand and the sand, he traces the question, makes the appropriate pentagram, and the sigil of the spirit. Before tracing the dashes which are to determine the four mothers, he must strictly examine himself. He must banish from his mind every thought which can possibly act as an attachment to his proposed partner. He must banish all thoughts which concern himself, those of apprehension no less than those of ardor. He must think of the question as if it did not concern him at all. He must carry his introspection as far as possible. He must observe with all the subtlety at his command whether it pains him to abandon any of these thoughts. So long as his mind is stirred, however slightly, by one single aspect of the subject, he is not fit to begin to form the figure. He must sink his personality in that of the intelligence, so that when he asks the question he seems to himself to be that intelligence hearing the question propounded by a stranger to whom he is indifferent, but whom it is his business to serve faithfully. He must now run over the whole affair in his mind, making sure of this utter aloofness therefrom. He must now run over the whole affair in his mind, making sure of his utter aloofness therefrom. He must also make sure that his muscles are perfectly free to respond to the touch of the will of the intelligence. It is of course understood that he has not become so familiar with geomancy by dint of practice as to be able to calculate subconsciously what figures he will form, for this would vitiate the experiment entirely. It is, in fact, one of the objections to geomancy that sooner or later one does become aware at the time of tracing whether the dots are going to be even or odd. This needs a special training to correct. Physiopsychological theory will probably maintain that the automatic action of the hand is controlled by the brain no less than in the case of conscious volition, but this is an additional argument for identifying the brain with the intelligence invoked. Having thus identified himself as closely as possible with that intelligence, and concentrated on the question as if the prophesying spirit were giving its whole attention thereto, he must await the impulse to trace the marks on the sand, and, as soon as it comes, let it race to the finish. Here arises another technical difficulty. One has to make 16 rows of dots, and, Especially for the beginner, the mind has to grapple with the apprehension lest the hand fail to execute the required number. It is also troubled by fearing to exceed, but excess does not matter. Extra lines are simply null and void, so that the best plan is to banish that thought, and make sure only of not stopping too soon. 1. The lines being traced, the operation is over as far as spiritual qualities are required, for a time. The process of setting up the figure for judgment is purely mechanical. But, in the judgment, the diviner stands once more in need of his inmost and utmost attainments. He should exhaust the intellectual sources of information at his disposal, and form from them his judgment. But having done this, he should detach his mind from what it has just formulated, and proceed to concentrate on the figure as a whole, almost as if it were the object of his mediation. One need hardly repeat that in both these operations detachment from one's personal partialities is as necessary as it was in the first part of the work. In setting up the figure, bias would beget a Freudian phantasm to replace the image of truth which the figure ought to be, and it is not too much to say that the entire subconscious machinery of the body and mind lends itself with horrid willingness to this ape-like antic of treason. But now that the figure stands for judgment, the same bias would tend to form its phantasm of wish fulfillment in a different manner. It would act through the mind to bewray sound judgment. It might, for example, induce one to emphasize the venereal element in Puella at the expense of the Saturnian. It might lead one to underrate the influence of a hostile figure, or to neglect altogether some element of importance. The master theorian has known cases where the diviner was so afraid of an unfavorable answer that he made actual mistakes in the simple mechanical construction of the figure. Finally, in the summing up, it is fatally easy to slur over unpleasantness, and to breathe on the tiniest spark that promises to kindle the tinder the rotten rags! Of hope. The concluding operation is therefore to obtain a judgment of the figure, independent of all intellectual or moral restraint. One must endeavor to apprehend it as a thing absolute in itself. One must treat it, in short, very much the same as one did the question, as a mystical entity, till now unrelated with other phenomena. One must, so to speak, adore it as a god, uncritically. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. It must be allowed to impose its intrinsic individuality on the mind, to put its fingers independently on whatever notes it pleases. In this way one obtains an impression of the true purport of the answer, and one obtains it armed with a sanction superior to any sensible suggestions. It comes from and to a part of the individual which is independent of the influence of environment, and is adjusted to that environment by true necessity, and not by the artifices of such adaptations as our purblind conception of convenience induces us to fabricate. The student will observe from the above that divination is in one sense an art entirely separate from that of magic, yet it interpenetrates magic at every point. The fundamental laws of both are identical. The right use of divination has already been explained, but it must be added that proficiency therein, tremendous as is its importance in furnishing the magician with the information necessary to his strategic and tactical plans, in no wise enables him to accomplish the impossible. It is not within the scope of divination to predict the future, for example, with the certainty of an astronomer in calculating the return of a comet. 1 There is always much virtue in divination, for, Shakespeare assures us, there is much virtue in if. In estimating the ultimate value of a divinatory judgment, one must allow for more than the numerous sources of error inherent in the process itself. The judgment can do no more than the facts presented to it warrant. It is naturally impossible in most cases to make sure that some important factor has not been omitted. In asking shall I be wise to marry? One leaves it open for wisdom to be defined in divers ways. One can only expect an answer in the sense of the question. The connotation of wise would imply the limitations in your private definition of wisdom, in reference to your present circumstances. It would not involve guarantee against subsequent disaster, or pronounce a philosophical dictum as to wisdom in the abstract sense. One must not assume that the oracle is omniscient. By the nature of the case, on the contrary, It is the utterance of a being whose powers are partial and limited, though not to such an extent, or in the same directions, as one's own. But a man who is advised to purchase a certain stock should not complain if a general panic knocks the bottom out of it a few weeks later. The advice only referred to the prospects of the stock in itself. The divination must not be blamed any more than one would blame a man for buying a house at Ypres 3 years before the World War. As against this, one must insist that it is obviously to the advantage of the diviner to obtain this information from beings of the most exalted essence available. An old witch who has a familiar spirit of merely local celebrity such as the toad in her tree, can hardly expect him to tell her much more of private matters than her parish magazine does of public. It depends entirely on the magician how he is served. The greater the man, the greater must be his teacher. It follows that the highest forms of communicating demons, those who know, so to speak, the court secrets, disdain to concern themselves with matters which they regard as beneath them. One must not make the mistake of calling in a famous physician to heal one's sick Pekingese. One must also beware of asking even the cleverest angel a question outside his ambit. A heart specialist should not prescribe for throat trouble. The magician ought therefore to make himself master of several methods of divination, using one or the other as the purpose of the moment dictates. He should make a point of organizing a staff of such spirits to suit various occasions. These should be familiar spirits in the strict sense, members of his family. He should deal with them constantly, avoiding whimsical or capricious changes. He should choose them so that their capacities cover the whole ground of his work, but he should not multiply them unnecessarily, for of course he makes himself responsible for each one that he employs. Such spirits should be ceremonially evoked to visible or semi-visible appearance. A strict arrangement should be made and sworn to. This must be kept punctiliously by the magician, and its infringement by the spirit severely punished. Relations with these spirits should be confirmed and encouraged by frequent intercourse. They should be treated with courtesy, consideration, and even affection. They should be taught to love and respect their master, and to take pride in being trusted by him. It is sometimes better to act on the advice of a spirit even when one knows it to be wrong, though in such a case one must take the proper precautions against an undesirable result. The reason for this is that spirits of this type are very sensitive. They suffer agonies of remorse on realizing that they have injured their master, for he is their God. They know themselves to be part of him. Their aim is to attain to absorption in him. They understand therefore that his interests are theirs. Care must be taken to employ none but spirits who are fit for the purpose, not only by reason of their capacity to supply information, but for their sympathy with the personality of the magician. Any attempt to coerce unwilling spirits is dangerous. They obey from fear, their fear makes them flatter, and tell amiable falsehoods. It also creates phantasmal projections of themselves to personate them, and these phantasms, besides being worthless, become the prey of malicious demons who use them to attack the magician in various ways whose prospect of success is enhanced by the fact that he has himself created a link with them. One more observation seems desirable while on this subject. Divination of any kind is improper in matters directly concerning the great work itself. In the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, the adept is possessed of all he can possibly need. To consult any other is to insult one's angel. Moreover, it is to abandon the only person who really knows, and really cares, in favor of one who by the nature of the case, must be ignorant one of the essence of the matter, one whose interest in it is no more, at the best, than that of a well-intentioned stranger. It should go without saying that until the magician has attained to the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel he is liable to endless deceptions. He does not know himself, how can he explain his business to others? How can those others, though they do their best for him, aid in anything but trifles? One must therefore be prepared for disappointment at every stage until one attains to adeptship. This is especially true of divination, because the essence of the horror of not knowing one's angel is the utter bewilderment and anguish of the mind, complicated by the persecution of the body, and envenomed by the ache of the soul. One puts the wrong questions, and puts them wrong, gets the wrong answers, and judges them wrong, and acts wrongly upon them. One must nevertheless persist, aspiring with ardor towards one's angel, and comforted by the assurance that he is guiding one secretly towards himself, and that all one's mistakes are necessary preparations for the appointed hour of meeting him. Each mistake is as it were the combing out of some tangle in the hair of the bride as she is being coiffed for marriage. On the other hand, although the adept is in daily communication with his angel, he ought to be careful to consult him only on questions proper to the dignity of the relation. One should not consult one's angel on too many details, or indeed on any matter which come within the office of one's familiar spirits. The romance and rapture of the ineffable union which constitutes adeptship must not be profaned by the introduction of commonplace cares. One must not appear with one's hair in curl papers, or complain of the cook's impertinence, if one wants to make the post of the honeymoon. One to the adept divination becomes therefore a secondary consideration, although he can now employ it with absolute confidence, and probably use it with far greater frequency than before his attainment. Indeed, this is likely in proportion as he learns that resort to divination, on every occasion when his will does not instantly instruct him, with implicit obedience to its counsels, careless as to whether or no they may land him in disaster, is a means admirably efficacious of keeping his mind untroubled by external impressions, and therefore in the proper condition to receive the reiterant strokes of rapture with which the love of his angel ravishes him. We have now mapped out the boundaries of possibility and propriety which define the physical and political geography of divination. The student must guard himself constantly against supposing that this art affords any absolute means of discovering truth, or indeed, of using that word as if it meant more than the relation of two ideas, each of which is itself as subject to change without notice as a musical program. Divination, in the nature of things, can do no more than put the mind of the current into conscious communication with another mind, whose knowledge of the subject at issue is to his own as that of an expert to a layman. The expert is not infallible. The client may put his question in a misleading manner, or even base it on a completely erroneous conception of the facts. He may misunderstand the expert's answer, and he may misinterpret its purport. Apart from all this, excluding error, both question and answer are limited in validity by their own conditions, and these conditions are such that truth may cease to be true, either as time goes on, or if it be flawed by the defect of failure to consider some circumstances whose concealed operation cancels the contract. In a word, divination, like any other science, is justified of its children. It would be extraordinary should so fertile a mother be immune from stillbirths, monstrosities, and abortions. We none of us dismiss our servant science with a kick and a curse every time the telephone goes out of order. The telephone people make no claim that it always works and always works right. One divination, with equal modesty, admits that it often goes wrong, but it works well enough, all things considered. The science is in its infancy. All we can do is our best. We no more pretend to infallibility than the mining expert who considers himself in luck if he hits the bull's-eye 4 times in 10. The error of all dogmatists, from the oldest prophet with his literally inspired word of God to the newest German professor with his single-track explanation of the universe, lies in trying to prove too much, in defending themselves against critics by stretching a probably excellent theory to include all the facts and the fables, until it bursts like the overblown bladder it is. Divination is no more than a rough and ready practical method which we understand hardly at all, and operate only as empirics. Success for the best diviner alive is no more certain in any particular instance than a long putt by a champion golfer. Its calculations are infinitely more complex than chess, a chess played on an infinite board with men whose moves are indeterminate, and made still more difficult by the interference of imponderable forces and unformulated laws, while its conduct demands not only the virtues, themselves rare enough, of intellectual and moral integrity, but intuition combining delicacy with strength in such perfection and to such extremes as to make its existence appear monstrous and miraculous against nature. To admit this is not to discredit oracles. On the contrary, the oracles fell into disrepute just because they pretended to do more than they could. To divine concerning a matter is little more than to calculate probabilities. We obtain the use of minds who have access to knowledge beyond our own, but this is not to say that these minds enjoy omniscience. HRU, the great angel set over the tarot, is beyond us as we are beyond the ant, but for all we know, the knowledge of HRU is excelled by some mightier mind in the same proportion. Nor have we any warrant for accusing HRU of ignorance or error if we read the tarot to our own delusion. He may have known, he may have spoken truly, the fault may lie with our own insight. 1 The Master Therian has observed on innumerable occasions that divinations, made by him and dismissed as giving untrue answers, have justified themselves months or years later when he was able to revise his judgment in perspective, untroubled by personal passion. It is indeed surprising how often the more carelessly done divinations give accurate answers. When things go wrong, it is almost always possible to trace the error to one's own self-willed and insolent presumption in insisting that events shall accommodate themselves to our egoism and vanity. It is comically unscientific to adduce examples of the mistakes of the diviners as evidence that their art is fatuous. Everyone knows that the simplest chemical experiments often go wrong. Everyone knows the eccentricities of fountain pens, but nobody outside evangelical circles makes fun of the Cavendish experiment, or asserts that if fountain pens undoubtedly work now and then, their doing so is merely coincidence. The fact of the case is that the laws of nature are incomparably more subtle than even science suspects. The phenomena of every plane are intimately interwoven. The arguments of Aristotle were dependent on the atmospheric pressure which prevented his blood boiling away. There is nothing in the universe which does not influence every other thing in one way or another. There is no reason in nature why the apparently chance combinations of half a dozen sticks of tortoiseshell one should not be so linked both with the human mind and with the entire structure of the universe that the observation of their fall should not enable us to measure all things in heaven and earth. With one piece of curved glass we have discovered uncounted galaxies of suns, with another, endless orders of existence in the infinitesimal. With the prism we have analyzed light so that matter and force have become intelligible only as forms of light. With a rod we have summoned the invisible energies of electricity to be our familiar spirit serving us to do our will, whether it be to outsoar the condor, or to dive deeper into the demon world of disease than any of our dreamers dared to dream. Since with 4 bits of common glass mankind has learnt to know so much, achieved so much, who dare deny that the Book of Thoth, the quintessentialized wisdom of our ancestors whose civilizations, perished though they be, have left monuments which dwarf ours until we wonder whether we are degenerate from them, or evolved from simians, who dare deny that such a book may be possessed of unimaginable powers? It is not so long since the methods of modern science were scoffed at by the whole cultured world. In the sacred halls themselves thrusts rang loud with the scornful laughter of the high priests as each new postulant approached with his unorthodox offering. There is hardly a scientific discovery in history which was not decried as quackery by the very men whose own achievements were scarce yet recognized by the world at large. Within the memory of the present generation, the possibility of aeroplanes was derisively denied by those very engineers accounted most expert to give their opinions. The method of divination, the ratio of it, is as obscure today as was that of spectrum analysis a generation ago. That the chemical composition of the fixed stars should become known to man seemed an insane imagining too ridiculous to discuss. Today it seems equally irrational to inquire of the desert sand concerning the fate of empires. Yet surely it, if anyone knows, should know. Today it may sound impossible for inanimate objects to reveal the inmost secrets of mankind and nature. We cannot say why divination is valid. We cannot trace the process by which it performs its marvels. 1 But the same objections apply equally well to the telephone. No man knows what electricity is, or the nature of the forces which determine its actions. We know only that by doing certain things we get certain results, and that the least error on our part will bring our work to naught. The same is exactly true of divination. The difference between the two sciences is no more than this, that, more minds having been to work on the former, we have learnt to master its tricks with greater success than in the case of the latter.